Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Thank you so very, very much. Well, I want to thank Steve for that generous and tastefully hyperbolic and vaguely obituarial introduction, the way it hit the highlights. And thanks to the Poetry Foundation and the Chicago Humanities Festival for the invitation to come to Chicago to wrap up your event, as it were. I'll begin with a poem. Actually, the first poem in this new little book called Walking Papers. Every morning in Milford, I start by going to coffee with a bunch of retirees, old farts I have called them. We discuss sleep apnea, Flomax, shoulder surgery, the usual things. And we do that for an hour over breakfast, and then we go home to our labors. I'm one of the few still employed among them, or still employed gainfully. And so I wrote this poem one Saturday called Euclid Comes to Coffee with the Old Farts. And my editor, Jill Bialowski, a very helpful and determined woman, said, maybe we could just call that Euclid. So Euclid. What sort of morning was Euclid having when he first considered parallel lines, or that business about how things equal to the same thing are equal to each other? Who's to know what a day has in it? This morning, Bert took it into his mind to make a longbow out of Osage orange, and went on eBay to find the cow horns from which to fashion the tips of the thing. You'd better have something to pass the time, he says, stirring his coffee, smiling. And Murray is carving a model truck from a block of walnut he found downstairs. Whittling away, he thinks of the years he drove between Detroit and Buffalo, delivering parts for General Motors. Might he have nursed theorems on lines and dots, or the properties of triangles, or the congruence of adjacent angles, or clearing customs at Niagara Falls arrived at some insight on wholes and parts, or an axiom involving radii and the making of circles, how distance from a center point can be both increased endlessly and endlessly split, a mystery whereby the local and the global share the same vexations and geometry. Possibly this is where God comes into it, who breathed the common notion of coincidence into the brain of that Alexandrian over breakfast 23 centuries back, who glimpsed for a moment that morning the sense it all made, life, killing time, the elements, the dots and lines and angles of connection, an eggshell opened with a spoon, the sun's connivance with the moon's decline, Sophia the maidservant pouring juice, everything coincides, the arc of memory, her fine parabolas, the bend of a bow, the curve of the earth, the turn in the road. The Episcopal rector of St. George's Church in Milford for years was Jake Andrews, a man who taught me an awful lot about just showing up at the right time to sort of earn your stripes as a local hero. He was the chaplain for the local police department and fire brigade, and he was the one always called for the unchurched people in Milford, a majority of the people, I must say, if they needed someone. And he would always be called if there was a homeless or indigent person to bury. Jake would be the one who would go the distance with them, standing in all weathers at graveside, reading from the Book of Common Prayer endlessly, regardless of the temperature. This is a poem called Father Andrews. Jake, for the record, life does go on. Tuesday gives way to Wednesday unremarkably. The stars in their firmament behave like stars. The morning traffic makes its mindless way from one preoccupation to another. Little changes. You knew as much yourself. We have our day and others after us, into their sparkling moment and out beyond. We have our little say and then are silent. But still you met the mourners at the door and pressed the heavens with their lamentations and tried to make some sense of all of it, then saw them to the edge and home again the way we see you now, our level man, out of the morning's worship into the sun, the coach at the curb, and on your way again. It struck me as one of those oddments of happenstance that President Bush and myself are launching books in the same week. I think he's at the Miami Book Festival today, where for $40 you can hear him read from Decision Points and get a copy of the book thrown in to boot. The last time he was reading in Florida, involved the goat. I think they made it into a film, Michael Moore did. Anyway, I've always identified with the president, the former president, because we're both about 60, both married up. We're both white and male and Christian with all the perks that come with that. And we both occupy that fraction of the population that doesn't have to sort of worry about keeping their body and their soul together as an hour-to-hour routine. He likes going to Crawford, Texas, where they have no bars and 5 churches. I like going to West Clare, where we have 1 church and 5 bars. And he keeps cattle and horses on his 2,000-acre ranch. I have a couple acres where I keep donkeys. Charles and Camilla, I call them. They are named for the lovebirds on the neighboring island. He fishes for bass in his private pond. I fish for mackerel off the cliffs of Dinwiddie. He left office with a popularity rating around, I think, 30%, whereas a funeral director who writes poems is a little bit like a proctologist with a sideline and root canal. We're never very popular. So I've identified with President Bush for years and years. And oftentimes when I'm in Ireland, where I try to spend as much time as I can surrounded by cattle and horses and jackasses, I look across the ocean and think of my home country in a different way, in the way that maybe you look across that great inland sea and think of Michigan in ways you never did before. Dear Mr. President, the black cow we put inside for Mrs. Murray to inseminate got its head stuck in a metal gate and couldn't get it out. What was she thinking, we said to each other? Talk about a rock and a hard place. Maybe it swelled some after she forced it through. Still, we couldn't get it out, though we kicked with our boots, twisted it every which way, cursed, swore, shouted, prayed. Nothing worked. The thing was stuck, and we were stuck with it. How could we go back to our lives with that beast out there, its fat head caught in the gate? We couldn't go to church or the movies or the store. What would we say when folks asked, how are things, as they do? In the end, we had to get a saw, one of those big round yokes that makes an awful noise and cuts through anything. After everything, we just cut it out. It was that simple, Mr. President. We just cut it out. One clean cut at the corner, bent it open until she pulled her thick head out and stood there looking like cows do, you know, blameless, serviceable, and dull. Just in time for the bull, which comes in a suitcase now, says Mrs. Murray, the inseminator, wearing a blue rubber glove all the way up to her shoulder, pushing deep inside of that beast, all the while looking up into the high roof joists of the shed where swallows were nesting. The look on her face, Mrs. Murray's, was, I have to tell you, Mr. President, so sublime, so beautiful. We said there is a science to everything. Oh, that's quite all right. If you like that one, maybe you'll like this one. Today is Condoleezza Rice's birthday, and the day they published Moby Dick in New York. We have a lot to thank Garrison Keillor for. That Writer's Almanac is one of them. What was it Melville said? Meditation and water are always wedded. You'd know that in Chicago, I suppose. Dear Madam Secretary, it was the bucket of oats I was giving the mare-ass that gave her wee she-foal the shits out there in the haggard, gazing at the wall incomprehensibly, the green ooze staining her rear flanks, her entire aspect badly shaken. Milk skewers, PJ diagnosed it and sent me to Williams, the chemist in town, for a big syringe and some sort of dose to restore the poor creature's proper fettle. It was pink, the dose was, and it smelled like berries. Mornings and evenings we'd bring her inside and get her to suckle a finger or thumb, then plunge the medicine down her throat. In no time she was out gamboling in the sweet grass, pulling at the pink dugs of the mare-ass, good we figured for donkey's years. Not so the painful case of a weanling Frisian that got a chill from the cold rain of a late June night, out in the lowed field, down and wheezing. Pneumonia, we figured, and could only hope the injection we gave it would save the thing. I found it in the shed the following morning, dead as any specimen has ever been, and what I wanted to share with you, Madam Secretary, out there with the shovel digging the grave, is that husbandry has its disappointments. What I am trying to say is that the way of things will not be tampered with. Or, as one of your colleagues once opined, stuff happens. Surely what he meant to say was, shit, Madam Secretary, it's shit that happens. Ask any ass. Maybe I'll, thank you. Maybe I'll chance a little fiction. My editors kept pressing me to write something that would sell. What was it that son of Illinois said, Don Marquis? Publishing poetry is like casting, rose petals over the Grand Canyon hoping for an echo. Isn't it just so? But fiction they actually read and review. So I wrote some. I was in one of those contentious, deep discussions with my wife, Mary, when, as a sort of a gobstopper, she said, "You've come to the age, Tom, where you just make shit up." Oh, I thought. So the reverend clergy have always been my heroes, and I knew that I wanted to make a clergy person the main character of this novella, this longish story I was writing called Apparition. And my grandmother was a Methodist woman who had to convert to what she would ever after call the one true faith. Tom, adding that lilt of doubt to the I remember she would explain the conversion experience to us, saying that the priest splashed a little water on me and said, "Geraldine, you were born a Methodist, raised a Methodist, thanks be to God, now you're Catholic." Some weeks after the eventual nuptials, she was out in the backyard grilling steaks for my grandfather on the first Friday in Lent when one of the brother knights from the KFC leapt over the back fence to upbraid her for the smell of beef rising over a Catholic household in the holy season, and she listened to your man and nodded and smiled in her quiet Methodist way, then walked over to the garden hose, splashed water on the grill, and said, "You were born cows, raised cows, Thanks be to God, now you're fish. And sent the man on his way. It was my first experience of the power of language and authority, that proclaiming and naming aspect that is so precious to writers. So this story, Apparition, is about a lapsed Methodist clergyman from Findlay, Ohio, or as a Presbyterian friend once said, isn't that redundant? But it involves his fall from grace. I'll give you 3 sections. The beginning paragraph goes like this. It was good riddance that put Adrian Littlefield on the lecture circuit. Before riddance, he'd self-published 2 pastel-covered self-help books with fashionably gerundive titles, Learning to Love in the Present Tense and Making the Best of Worst-Case Scenarios. They were widely ignored and only sold to his family and folks at the church where he was the assistant pastor in those early years of marriage and parenthood. He'd done a workbook on dividing family duties between spouses and written a couple of articles for the ministerial press, but otherwise was going nowhere and barely making ends meet until after Clare left him. He wrote, Good Riddance, Divorcing for Keeps, and it changed his life. It held that some divorces, like some marriages, are made in heaven, and we ought to be thankful for them. The key to living in concert with God's will or the natural order or what the fates had in mind for you was to learn to accept the direction of your love life, even when it meant the end of love. Divorce was neither the result of too much of one thing nor too little of another, too many heartbreaks or too few. It was, like tsunamis and famines, hurricanes and genocides, God's way of culling humanity's herd of lovers for reasons that were unknowable to mortals, but part, nonetheless, of a larger plan. Shit happens, Adrian Littlefield told his readers unambiguously. We must go with the flow. That's life. Get over it. Get on with it. It took him 6 months to write it, a month to get an agent, and another month to get a contract and a fat advance from a publisher in New York. It was an immediate hit. The first printing sold out in a week. The paperback rights went for $500,000. There was talk of a documentary for one of the cable networks. The invitations followed. He worked up a little 40-minute shtick for the keynotes and workshops. He could bend his presentation, peppered with suggestive humor, around the occupational curiosities of any association. He had an infomercial in post-production, one of those hour-long specials where he wore baggy clothes and did a little chalk talk with a really attractive studio audience. He traveled 3 months out of every 4 from his home office in Findlay, Ohio, where he housed behind his sprawling red-brick Queen Anne mansion in a carriage house he'd refurbished with money from his books and lectures, the Center for Postmarital Studies, an elaborate tax shelter along with the foundation that raised funds to advance the work of the CPMS, which was primarily to pay its principal apostle, himself, to spread the word such as it was revealed to him. He'd kept pace with the technologies of communication, from blast fax to website and blogosphere, some nights posting the latest news to his website or linking a recent interview so his followers could listen in. He felt not a little like Paul, writing epistles to the various churches. If, as that great circuit writer wrote, it is better to marry than to burn, was it not much better still to divorce than to smolder? X's, Adrian's favorite slogan held, you can't live with him and you can't shoot him. A little good riddance goes a long, long way. Now, because this is a novella, we have to, as is the formula, go back and see how he got to be the fellow he is at the beginning of the book. So he reviews the dissolution of his marriage, and it turns out that, to make a long story short, his wife ran away with a classmate from the video program at Findlay Community College. They run away to Cincinnati. Ostensibly to film something about Boone's Ferry crossing the Ohio River. Adrian sends someone to follow them and take pictures, and none of it's a deal breaker until he comes to a picture of the two of them embracing Clare and David at the top of Mount Adams in front of the Church of the Immaculate Conception. Some of you know Cincinnati. It overlooks the Ohio River Valley in a way that would take your breath away. This was where Adrian had proposed to Clare years before, and it seems a terrible betrayal. That she would share their places with someone else seemed a more intimate betrayal than even sex. He called the attorney. He wept giving their particulars, full names, birth dates, date of marriage. The papers would be filed in the morning. She was served as she left her class with David on Monday night. Adrian had left on Sunday afternoon and taken the children to visit his parents in Grand Rapids. He left a manila envelope on the bed with photos of her and David coming and going from their assorted rendezvous, and a note that told her that he had chapter and verse on her film project and would be using them against her if she contested anything. It would be a slam dunk. She was to move out now. He underlined the word now. In the end, of course, she moved out not because of his threats, but because of himself and the dull life with him she could no longer endure. She moved out because that's exactly what she wanted to do, and Clare could be counted on to do what she wanted. When Adrian and his son Damien and his daughter Sarah came home that Tuesday in the middle of June to the house they had all shared on the corner of South Corey and Lima Avenue, some blocks from the river that flowed through Findlay, Clare and her things were unmistakably gone. She had moved out into an apartment on the other side of town. She told the children she would always love them and would be coming back for them as soon as she got herself established. Everything is going to be really terrific. You're going to love New York, she told them. There's so much to see and do there. Not like finally Ohio. Wait and see. She'd come back for the last bits and pieces of her things. The white Toyota van was idling at the curb with the back doors open for Clare to pitch garbage bags full of her clothes and linens. They kept nodding and smiling and weeping and hugging her, their little hands and faces holding and searching and wondering why this was all happening and why couldn't she stay with them and be their mother, and she would always be their mother, no matter what. And someday she was sure they'd understand. And Adrian went into the house and vomited because he felt so helpless, so totally lost in the tears of things, so angry and heart-rent and utterly helpless, and their mother's voices trailing off as she left them on the porch, waving and sobbing, and jumped into the van with her lover and drove off into the future. Adrian stood looking out the screen door at the small figures of his children on the porch, all of this happening in slow motion now as the van disembarked, and they raised their little hands and waved and waved and waved. No remembrance of these events was free of the guilt Adrian still felt for the damage done, his son and daughter, his complicity in its infliction. Now what he could remember was the creak of the spring on the screen door as he pushed it open and held it open and said, "Come in now," and how the two of them turned, limp from the waving and weeping, and how Damien took his sister Sarah's hand and brought her back inside their suddenly and terribly broken home. This was the moment these many years since that Adrian Littlefield could never forgive himself for failing his darling son and precious daughter so profoundly, for doing them such unspeakable damage by failing to keep their mother home, the marriage together, the household intact, life as they had come to know it, safe and warm and blessed with abundant love. He couldn't protect his children from this hurt. His wife, their mother, had just driven off with her new lover in a white van, leaving them all fixed and wriggling in the here and now without a clue as to what the future would hold. And as much as his heart hurt for his children's damage, standing at the kitchen counter, buttering bread to make them grilled cheese sandwiches, and pouring out 3 matching glasses of milk, and cutting up a green apple into 6 little wedges, and placing this meal before them and holding their tiny hands, saying, "Let us pray," and hearing their voices give out with the accustomed grace to it, "God is great, God is good," some corner of his broken, brooding heart quickened with the hope that his own life and times might just have gotten better, easier, simpler, saner somehow. Good riddance, he did not say out loud while they ate their sandwiches wordlessly, but he said it nonetheless. Good riddance, indeed. Now, all of the neighboring clergy send consolations by mail, but do not visit in case this could be contagious, And all but one, the Catholic priest who has no worry about the contagion of marriage or divorce. His name is Francis Ex-Con Canon, and he believes that the right thing to do for the suffering pilgrim is to join them in the pilgrimage. So he comes by bringing alcohol and help with the laundry and books of poetry and his own associated vengeance about women. And then he brings the 4th grade teacher from St. Michael's School in Findlay, Ohio, to babysit the kids one night and take Adrian out for a proper night after months of single parenting. He drives him up I-75 to Detroit and over the bridge to Windsor, Ontario for an Italian meal and a visit to what he calls the Windsor Ballet. On the way, he smokes some really powerful controlled substances, which gives Adrian sort of a contact high, and he feeds him too much Bordolino at dinner, and other things happen, which eventuate in the priest pouring the poor Methodist minister back into his bed in Findlay, Ohio, many hours later. It's a Saturday night. He's passed out. The babysitter's sleeping on the couch. The priest gives a benediction over it all and leaves the place. The next morning, Adrian has to preach at St. Mark's, and I pick it up there. The Reverend Adrian Littlefield, recently quit by his adulterous wife, recently angry and lonely and bone-tired of the duties of single parenting, recently despairing, recently at wit's end over his prospects, recently drunk, recently stoned, recently a patron of a topless, bottomless bar in Windsor, Ontario, and only a matter of hours after having sex with his children's babysitter, whose first name he could remember but whose surname had escaped him, had stood in the sanctuary under the massive stained glass likeness of Christ his Lord and before the faithful congregants of St. Mark's United Methodist Church on South Main Street in Findlay, Ohio, and uncharacteristically lost for words, cleared his throat, opened his arms as Moses before the Red Sea, and raising his inexplicably grinning face heavenward instead of commencing a sermon, sang out, off key, but enthusiastically in evident praise and thanksgiving for all of his recent iniquities. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me. He stepped from behind the oaken pulpit, stationed himself in front of the altar, and smiling widely raised his voice again. And when the broken-hearted people living in, he was into the next verse, though he wasn't entirely sure he knew it. And when the night is cloudy, there is, and might have even made some sense of all of it, but the Reverend Dr. Hingston, his senior pastor, sensing something in his associate's matter was terribly amiss, and worried that the 11 o'clock service was to go seriously off track, rose from his seat behind the pulpit and led the people in polite applause, then wordlessly, by nod and glaring, signaled the ushers at the back of church to pass the plates for an offering. A couple of spiky-haired teens dressed in black and emblazoned with tattoos and seated with their perpetually embarrassed parents arose during Adrian's brief solo and, thrusting their fists into the air, took up the chorus. Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. While one air keyboarded the piano chords and the other air guitared the heavy bass notes of the refrain, all the while nodding their spiky heads furiously in time. Marilyn Rubritis, the unmarried and, it was rumored, heavily medicated daughter of the long-widowed Geraldine Rubritis, stood in the middle of the pew she and her mother had occupied quietly for nearly half a century, unknotted her long silver hair from the bun it had been in all of her life, till it fell in quick, luxuriant waves over the red cashmere sweater she always wore to church, and began to sway with the music rhythmically, her bony shoulders upturned and her arms outreaching and her skinny hips achieving a kind of tidal sway, and the look on her face one of ecstasy, the way you'd imagine young hippie girls at Woodstock years before. Cleta Losi, the organist, never one to be caught off guard, had taken up the tune, which of course she knew, while the Reverend Hingston tried from his side of the sanctuary to eyeball her to quit, and the ushers moved with the gilded plates up the aisles, and everyone reaching for their tithes and offerings looked back and forth at one another, wondering what it was they had just suddenly witnessed. It had lasted only a couple of minutes, but it was sufficiently outside the pale of their erstwhile church experiences that they knew something unforeseen and unplanned had just happened. "Did you see them?" whispered Adrian, still grinning like a simpleton. "The heavenly hosts," as Reverend Hingston led him to the vestry, while the bell choir, after a series of dagger looks from the pastor and accustomed to playing for tune, took up their rendition of "How Great Thou Art." After removing his stole and cincture and robe and following the Reverend Hingston's directive, Adrian collected his children from their Sunday school classes, loaded them into the Honda, and drove them home. He sang all the way home. And because he could not keep from grinning, Damien and Sarah grinned back at him. For the first time in months, they all looked joyous. I tell you, Francis, it was the closest thing to inspiration I have ever felt. The breath of God, as if I'd been suddenly loosed from the bonds of gravity and routine. Always before I'd be trying to say something that would touch their souls, while they'd all be trying not to fall asleep. But this was different. I tell you, Francis, I felt alive, and they looked alive to me. For the first time, I looked out over that little sea of faces and saw them all as fellow pilgrims. Not fellow United Methodists or fellow Christians or fellow sinners, just fellow humans in search of a way home. And I could see that what they didn't need was another sermon. It's as if I could see myself in them, hapless and lonely, holy and free, all of us somehow in it together. Francis, we're just trying to find our way home, wondering if we're going to make it. The priest nodded and smiled and sipped his tea while Adrian carried on. It was an apparition, Francis. They looked like innocents, angels, every one of them. I tell you, I could see their wings. I could see them readying to take their flights. Cora Perkins, Fat Bill Wapner, the grievous Fielding couple with their punk rock twins, they all just looked so lovely to me, these people whose people I've been burying and marrying and baptizing. Poor Marilyn Rebrightus, old Henry Richardson in his wingtips and banker suit, Art Geyer with his homely wife, the Morris sisters, just turned 14 and 15, proud of their new little figures the way boys are suddenly watching them now. Frida Chambers with her goiter and bug eyes. They all looked like cherubim and seraphim and archangels, and all I wanted to tell them, Francis, was that everything is going to be all right. Everything would turn out fine in the end. I could see it all, Francis. They'd all be fine and flying again. A beatific vision, Father Francis said. Was that some dope or what? It wasn't the dope, Francis, Adrian said. I think it started after Mary, what's her name? The priest sat up in the wingback, set his mug on the side table, and leaned into the conversation. Mary Didona. What about her? Well, she came to me in the night. There was this dream, and I just woke up, and she was there. There? Well, she was on top of me, and she was naked, and the beatific vision, Father Concannon said, sitting back, pressing his head into the high back of the chair, smiling broadly. Adrian looked puzzled. A pastoral visit. The priest was evidently not surprised. God bless her. Now, there's a woman with truly priestly instincts. I'm past my time, and I want to... Thank you. Let me finish with one short poem. Every year I try to do one on my birthday as a sign that I was still sentient. So I do a sonnet because they were fairly easy knockoffs, 14 lines. You know the rules, huh? And so when I turned 52, I wrote this beauty, which turned out to have 15 lines in it by some... which leads me to the wisdom that the older we get, the less we count. And accounts for its title, Refusing at 52 to Write Sonnets. I must tell you, to have a room full of people listening to this, blather is a little bit like going to the shrink and not getting a bill for it. I'm very grateful to you. You're very kind. It came to him that he could nearly count how many Octobers he had left to him in increments of 10 or, say, 11, thus 63, 74, 85. He couldn't see himself at 96, humanities advances notwithstanding in health care, self-help, or New Age regimens. What with his habits and family history? The end, he thought, is nearer than you think. The future, thus confined to its contingencies. The present moment opens like a gift. The balding month, the gray week, the dull morning, the hours routine, the minutes passing glance, all seem like godsends now. And what to make of this? At the end, the word that comes to us is thanks. Thanks. Thank you.
Thomas?
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm John Barr from the Poetry Foundation, and I've just heard one of the most entertaining and wonderful readings I can think of in many years. So, Thomas, thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Has anyone from Hollywood tried to option the apparition?
More's the pity, but no. I always have film documentarians coming around. PBS Frontline did a film of called The Undertaking. They promised me I'd look like Brad Pitt in it. I was fairly disappointed, but no Hollywood calls yet.
Maybe we could talk a little bit at the start about your different genres. I can't think of many writers offhand that have turned their hands so successfully at so many different genres, but I think over the last quarter century you've published perhaps 7 books of poetry, fiction, nonfiction essays, and I'd love to hear you talk about how they relate to one another.
The poetry is a thing that, at least for me, without which nothing else happens. You know, poetry for me is sort of like the tuning fork for language. If you don't get it right, then the rest is not as joyous as it can be when sentences are working and paragraphs and narratives work their way. I always read a lot of poetry, and it's like, you know, I mean, writers are readers who go karaoke. They just hear it long enough and they think, I'll sing along with that too. And I still find that nothing sets the day right better than poetry. So it is the thing I must do as a form of exercise. You see, I don't jog there. Nonfiction essaying seems to be like poetry, portable in the sense that you can walk around with it. It seems like journey and pilgrimage and voyage to not necessarily an answer or an outcome, but at least you seem to bring things around that ring true to you. And essaying in that sense, I use Montaigne's model that you should start with your human condition and work out from there, as a correspondent would. I think Montaigne began as a correspondent with someone who read closely. And fiction always, I always thought it was much more work-a-day. You had to sort of, and my own work life, much as yours, you know, that they can be compelling things. So I always thought not until I had come to the time in my work life where I could say, I won't be in today, that I could stay with a portion of a story that I was on, did I ever take it up. But it is, I find, I'm very fortunate to know writers who can give you sort of the quick tour of these things. And when I found out you don't have to know the end of a story to start one out, it was very liberating.
Well, the essays seem so seamlessly constructed, and they really describe great arcs over many pages, and they're wonderfully organic when they're done. I wonder if an essay develops for you differently than the way a poem would develop, for example.
Well, a poem almost always has an acoustic birthing. There's always a line or a rhyme or some statement that really does. There is a line usually, and it might be hours, days, weeks, years before it finds its way to an outcome. But you can carry it around, saying it over and over to yourself. But the genesis is acoustic. You hear it, and I'm not the first to observe this. Whereas
I think Frost said the first line is the gift, and the rest is work.
That's right. Yeah, is exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. And whereas essaying is just sort of walking around things. It does seem that you can do things. Poetry seems like all diamond making, like constant subtraction, constant whittling, whereas essaying seems like you can add a few planks, and the stuff you throw away making a poem makes serviceable infrastructure for an essay.
Terrific.
Yeah. Fiction is different than that. Yeah.
Well, your love of writing, or the craft of writing, is palpable, I think, throughout your work. In the quality of the sentences, the lyrical lifts, it's a joy to read, no matter what genre it is, but it's terrific. Could we talk a little bit about Ireland? Ireland appears in your earliest poetry. I think it's ancestral to you. It's a place where you spend time, I believe, even today. You write poems about the farming communities there. But has your relationship to Ireland or its importance evolved over your long career?
Well, in a way, John, the bills are coming due now. I showed up in 1970, I think it was 21. I had a one-way ticket, $100, no prospects. I got a high number in the Nixon draft lotto. And because I was a lackluster university student, I thought I better do something of substance. So I'll go to Ireland and write poems, I said to my parents, And I showed up at what were my grandfather's first cousins, a bachelor and spinster trying to eke a living out on the West Coast, in a thatched cottage. You've all seen the postcards. It was just such a place. And I think I must have been a very disappointing Yank, because I wasn't good for much of anything. And but I stayed for 4 months. They kept me, and it changed my life. But over the 40 years of coming and going and relating to people, now I have to go back for the weddings and funerals and things like that. So every winter I go into the winter thinking, what will happen in Moveen this year? Because there is a short list of people for which those attachments are binding, and. But it was a great gift that the house that my great-grandfather came out of in 1890, I can look out of the same window, stand on the same stones. Nothing changes in the geography. The ocean is as close as the lake is here. And that's just, I just feel.
Where is that house?
It's on the West Clare Peninsula between the North Atlantic and the Shannon Estuary. So I can see both from where I am. It's a treeless, windswept, poor end of a county, and the same families have been there forever and ever, and when I walk in the door, I feel home.
Wonderful. That's great. Thomas, I think death is a subject that every writer worth his or her salt comes to at some point, but for you it has been the subject. And I wonder if that's because of your other career as a mortician, or if there are other reasons that death has served you so well as a subject.
I think it was Yeats who was writing to Olivia Shakespeare, who said that the only thing that should trouble an academic or a serious mind are sex and death. I thought, how handy for me. I really approve of sex. And I was surrounded by the dead, and I thought, this is going to work out for me. And Yeats was, I don't think I'm the guy who discovered death. It was inevitable that someone who did funerals would end up writing poems and publishing them. I owe that to, by the way, John Frederick Nims and Poetry Magazine, who published my first poems.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And in fact, the first poem I ever published was called, unremarkably, A Death, but it was about a woman I'd gone to school with since childhood who died of a brain tumor at 30. And after I'd done this poem, I called my friend Michael Heffernan and said, if you had one magazine to send to, where would you send it? Poetry's the place, he said.
Oh, that's
so
great.
I did. I sent it to poetry.
A quick aside, John Frederick Nims, some of you may know of, but he was a distinguished editor of Poetry magazine years ago, and also a wonderful man. I knew him very briefly as an undergraduate. But he used to get letters submitted to him by Ruth Lilly.
Yes.
And he was so, I've seen his rejection letters, he never took any, and they were so courtly and so gracious that they obviously weren't a problem when she came time to settle her estate. So John Frederick Nims is a hero for many people.
He's my hero, I have to say.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, his first letter to me was not an acceptance or a rejection. It was, "Dear Mr. Lynch, is this your style?" He said, "You may punctuate correctly or not at all, but nowhere in between." And he said, if you want to try the punctuation again, I'll have another look. I mean, it was an elegant, typed out letter. Yeah, I was very fortunate.
Wonderful human being. We're going to take about the last 10 minutes of our time for any of you that might like to ask questions from the audience, and I believe there's a microphone that'll be circulated right there. I have a last question for me, Thomas, and then I'll introduce to your public. But with 2 books just out, it's probably not fair to ask what's next, but having said that, what's next?
I have a little book of poems called The Sin Eater, a Breviary that Paraclete Press will be publishing next September, if God is good, whoever she is. And I've just finished it, and it's kind of a joint thing. My son Michael did the black and white photographic images that accompany the 24 poems, and my son Sean is doing the cover art. He's an artist, so it's sort of a Lynch and Sons production. Nice. So I'm looking forward to it.
We look forward to it.
Thank
we
you,
look
John.
forward to it.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, any questions for the author?
If not, I have the poetry reading that will go on for another hour.
How did you get into the funeral director business, and is it a family business?
Yes. My father was a funeral director, and of his 9 children, all but 2 of them now work in one of the many funeral homes in southeastern Michigan that bear our parents' names. But he used to push us in the other direction because it was like always having to, it's like not having enough acres to split up among your children, But he was the most respected. I mean, I really admired him and saw how he intersected with people at this very difficult time in their family history. And was, when people would not only pay him, but write him these long letters of thanks, I thought, well, he's been a force for good in their life. And I thought, I want to do some of that.
Mr. Lynch, the first thing I remember when watching that documentary about you, and certainly you look like Brad Pitt, but was it either an essay or a poem you wrote about preparing your father when he died? Was that from your poetry, or was it an essay? I can't remember that.
I think there's an essay about that. Yeah, my brother Pat's a funeral director. Our father died in Florida, and so we got on the plane and flew down to prepare his body and bring it home. It was good duty. People would say, that must have been very hard embalming your father. I said, my father's death was very hard. Doing our part just seemed like, actually a gift in the way that making the right casserole or singing the right solo or bearing your part of whatever that burden is.
I've always heard that the superiority in English is the English that's used by the Irish. Were you influenced at all by your visits to Ireland? Thank you.
Well, certainly the Irish have a gift for blathermentia, or as they call it in the western parishes, gobshite, But there is this thing they have to bring to the before television, which is to say about 5 years ago in Ireland. The only entertainment for country people was within walking distance, so people would bring to the evening a song or a story or a poem or some party piece by which to entertain themselves. I thought, I must be a remarkable man. Everybody's asking me questions. It's just that I sounded different from them, and they'd heard all their own stories endlessly. But, the Irish can cut with language, but they can also talk all day and say nothing. If they want to. If there's no more questions, let me just finish. Oh. Okay. Maybe further to the discussion of Irish languages. People often ask me what my favorite funeral was, and I have several, but the Irish have an aptitude for this that you should. And I was at one last April, as a matter of fact. A neighbor died, and I was summoned to the house, as the rest of the people in the townland were, and I was in earshot of the widow. The man was laid out in the kitchen, and I was in earshot of the widow when the parish priest came to make his pastoral visit, and he said, Mary, whatever happened, we never knew J.J. was sick at all. She said, Father, it was the gonorrhea that got him. The priest blushed, as priests often do, or did, and he said, we've never had anyone in this parish die of gonorrhea, Mary. It must have been that time he went up north and fell in with the wrong crowd, maybe. He said, never mind, he was a good man. We'll have Mass in the morning. No more about it. He walked away, the beads of sweat glistening on his bald head. And I was still in earshot when the daughter of the house came around to upbraid her mother, saying, Mammy, why did you ever tell Father Culligan that Daddy died of gonorrhea? It wasn't gonorrhea that swept him, it was diarrhea. And can't you get that right, she says. She says, don't scold me too much, my dear. I'd rather your father be remembered for the great lover he never was than for the big shit he always seemed to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas.